Let me just read you something quickly here from Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children about the nature of the development of the black child. Here's a study that was done in Kenya and Uganda on African children. A study that was supposed to look at the effects of malnutrition, and where the white psychologists and others went over to look at the development of black children, and they expected these children to be retarded in their development. Let me just read a piece here of a description of what they found. In 1956, Marcel Gibert, under a research grant from the United Nations Children Fund, traveled to Africa to study the effects of malnutrition on infant and child intelligence. Let's pick the people who suffer from malnutrition the most, and we'll get a clear case as to what the effects of malnutrition are on children's development and intelligence. But they made a momentous discovery. She found the most precocious, brilliant, and advanced infants and children ever observed anywhere. These infants had smiled continuously and rapturously from at least their 4th day of life. Blood analyses showed that all the adrenal steroids connected with birth stress were totally absent by the 4th day after birth. Sensory motor learning and development were phenomenal, indeed miraculous. This is what we talk about when we talk about black child development. This is not a child who happens to be black. We're talking about an African child whose Africanness is a part of their total development orientation. A superior intellectual development held for the first 4 years of life. So we're not talking about children who only differ in color or different in the way they grow in terms of their bone development and teeth development. We're not talking about the fact that black children speak before white children, months ahead of white children. They walk months ahead of white children, and so forth. We are also talking about the fact that their intellectual characteristics are in advance of white children. We're not talking about the mere fact of black children who can do things at 2 days old that it will take a white child a month and a half to do. You understand? So you've got to know yourself. Let's continue. These infants were awake a surprising amount of time, which meant that they were able to take in information from the world and learn from the world and be shaped by the world, because they weren't spending all of their time asleep to the world. Alert, watchful, happy, calm. They virtually never cried. The mother responded to the infant's every gesture and assisted the child in any and every move that was undertaken, so that every move initiated by the child ended in immediate success. And I don't have time to talk about the psychology of what this sentence means, but it implies that you begin to build confidence in children from the very first day by responding to their needs. And by meeting their needs, you begin to build in them a sense of competence, that when they indicate a need, the world will respond, that they can control what happens to them by projecting certain types of communicational signals to the world. In other words, self-confidence, a sense of competence, a sense of initiative, a sense of self-control and so forth begins to be developed in a child from the very first moment of birth, depending on how the parent responds to the child and depending on how the environment responds to the child. And when we look then at the way African mothers respond to these children, we see a reciprocal relationship going on. Their response to these children and the ability of these children to emit responses reciprocate each other and advance the intellectual and physical development of these children. He goes on to say that at 2 days of age, 48 hours, these infants sat bolt upright, held only by the forearms, with a beautifully straight back and perfect head balance, their finely focused eyes staring intently, intelligently at their mothers, and they smiled and smiled and smiled. Now, they gave these children tests a bit later, and one test here involved, at 6 weeks old, 7 weeks, a particular, let's read it. At 6 or 7 weeks, these children crawled skillfully and could sit up by themselves and would sit spellbound before a mirror, looking at their own images for long periods. This particular ability was not to be expected in European American children, in the American European child before 24 weeks. What are we saying here? That the African child is exhibiting at the 6th and 7th week, okay, those things that the American European child is not expected to exhibit until the 6th month. So we're not talking about children who happen to be black, you see, or children who are colored, you see. We're talking about children who are the children of the first of mankind on this earth. And as the black man was the first to walk on this earth, the black child is the first child to walk as a child. And as the black man was the first to speak language on this earth, the black child is the first to use language and symbols. As the black man was the first to draw intelligent conclusions and build cities and nations and to engineer the world, the black child exhibits in its psychomotor responses and its ability to coordinate its bodies with its mind before white children, that the history of black people is yet in the genes of his children, and that the potential of the black man is in the potential of his children. But a people who do not know themselves, who do not know their history, who believe the propaganda put out by racists, who have such an inferiority complex until they are willing to step down to white folk instead of living up to their potential, will destroy the potential that they have. There is no reason on earth for the black man to be ruled by white folk or any other man. There's no reason for the black man to be dependent on any other people. You can only see that as your natural role, and you can only see that as your natural place in the world if you've come to believe lies and mythologies, and if you've come to believe in your own inferiority as a people. And the greatest damage then that is done to African children in these educational establishments today is done through the low expectations of African American parents and of the African American community and the low expectations of other people who have no knowledge of who African people are and the potential of our people as a whole. Therefore, you got to know who you are. At 2 days old, and we'll bring it to a close here in a minute, these infants set upright, held between 6 and 7 months, the Uganda children performed the toy box retrieval test. Jabir, that's the psychologist, showed the infant a toy, walked across the room, put the toy in a tall box. The child leaped up, ran across the room, and retrieved the toy. Besides the sensory motor skills of walking and retrieval, the test shows that the object constancy had taken place. The first great shift of logical processing in the brain, at which point an object out of sight is no longer out of mind, the characteristic of infancy and early childhood. This test, successfully completed by Ugandan children between 6 and 7 months of age, was not to be expected until somewhere between the 15th and the 18th months in American and European child. We're not talking about people who happen to be colored. You understand? But if you don't know yourself, if you don't know your developmental history, if you don't know that your psychology as an individual and your psychology as a people comes out of your unique experience as an individual and as a people, if you're not aware of this, if you're not aware of how your experience as a people shapes the way you think, the way you see the world, the way you see yourself, shapes your very values, shapes your motivations, shape your goals and aims in life. If you're not aware of that, and if you're not aware of how the American experience has shaped these things to fit the dominance of white folk, then you're going to miseducate your children, you're going to miseducate yourself, and you're going to remain under the domination and control, not only of white folk, but of any other folk that comes into this country and comes into this world. Arabs will rule over you, Latins will rule over you, Asians will rule over you, everybody will rule over you, and anybody who has a sense of who they are, what they are, anyone who operates and educates their children according to their tradition, according to their background, according to their history, according to their identity. The Japanese educate their children in terms of their Japanese-ness. not in terms of white folk, not in terms of black folk, but in terms of themselves. It is the brainwashed Negro who tries to educate himself as if he were not black, but as if he were some white person. And this leads to miseducation, if no education at all.